go to it this year.
Well, good morning, everyone.
Good
Thank you
morning.
for joining us today and braving the streets. Well, I don't think they were too bad, were they?
No.
Excellent. I think you all know me by now and probably could recite my little spiel by yourselves at this point, but my name is Jack Martin. I'm the Archivist and Special Collections Librarian here at Patent Free Library. It's so wonderful to see everybody coming out for the 21st year of the Town History Series. Hard as it is to believe that it's been going that long. Peter Goodwin started it all the way back in 2005. And if the years seem odd, it's because there was one in 2005, therefore making that the first year and this the 21st, even though it's 20 years later. Weirdness with math. This morning, this is our third talk for this series. I just want to quickly remind everyone that this presentation is being recorded and live streamed to YouTube. It'll be available on the Patent Free Library YouTube channel early next week. The upside of our new system is we have very quick turnaround on those uploads, so it doesn't take nearly as long as it used to. For those who are joining us on YouTube, unlike previous years, there will be no we don't have a good way of doing the online Q&A. So we'll have an email address that'll be in the description of the uploaded video, and you can email in any questions that you have. We're sorry that you can't quite participate like the people who are here in person, but we're doing our best with the system. Speaking of our speaker, though, I'm very pleased to welcome her this morning. She's one of PFL's own trustees, and she's going to be sharing with us the history of Josephine Newman and the preserve that she left to Georgetown. And so without further ado from me, I will turn things over to Ms. Lauren Bray herself.
Today, if we know the name.
Hang on, we'll fix this. Coming over floor. Yeah, I'm just gonna turn your mic back on for you. Okay. Should be good.
Today, if we know the name Josephine Newman, we think of a place, not a person. Josephine Newman Audubon Sanctuary is 115 acres of some of mid-coast Maine's most beautiful landscape. There are hiking trails that lead across a meadow and crisscross a forested peninsula, flanked on both sides by tidal water. Standing at the head of the meadow, if you look closely, the only sign of Josephine herself is the remains of a stone foundation. These granite blocks help us remember that behind the Josephine Newman Sanctuary is a real person. A woman who lived on these acres for many years. In her time, it was a lively home filled with music and study and chores, from where she explored a landscape
that she both loved like a poet and studied like a scientist. And in 1968, she donated that land that she loved so we can enjoy it today. My goal in this talk is to help us remember this remarkable woman, not simply for the gift that she gave us all, but for the rich and interesting life that she lived in that place. Born in 1978. Sorry, born in 1878. Josephine Holman Oliver came from a long line of Georgetowners, going back to John Parker, who in 1649 purchased the island known as Muskegon from the Native Americans living there. Josephine's mother, Florence Holman, came from a large family in Marlow, in central Maine. Her maternal grandfather, Daniel Holman, was the first librarian of the Bangor Public Library. Josephine was the oldest of four, two girls and two boys, born in Boston, where their father, Sewell Parker Oliver, was a dry goods merchant. When she was school-aged, her parents moved to Georgetown and bought a house wrapped in stone walls and woods in the middle of a meadow with a view down into the center of town. There was a general store with a post office, a community hall with a library, a school, and a sawmill. She grew up here, there on the hill. As a young woman, she had the benefit of a good education. In keeping with the common practice, if you lived rurally, she was sent away for high school, living with relatives in Bangor. Home from high school in the summer, this is Josephine on the left, with a friend and sister Maud. It looks like they're berry picking. Then moving on to college, she earned a professional teaching degree at the Farmington Normal School, established in 1863, first public post-secondary school in Maine, founded exclusively for the training of teachers. There, Josephine absorbed the principles of a new movement, progressive education, in which, in addition to learning the core content of a liberal education, students were expected to develop their minds beyond the limits of rote and memorization. We have two photos from that time. Josephine on the left, her sister Maud on the right. And with the two of them with three friends. Joe is on the far right. I think she enjoyed her college years because we know from this program dated 1955 that she joined other alum at a school reunion in Farmington. In 1903, there were 50 graduates in Josephine's class. Today, there are more than 170 teacher graduates at the University of Maine, Farmington. After graduating, Josephine, who was 24 then, went home to Georgetown. She taught for 2 years in this one-room schoolhouse, walking and snowshoeing more than 2.5 miles each way. And then she headed out into the world, expanding her horizons in education outside of Maine. She taught for a while at a private school in Pennsylvania, which was quite a switch from the one-room school in Georgetown. At the same time, we see the beginnings of what became a lifelong love of pottery. She took botany courses for teachers at the University of Pennsylvania and became involved in the local garden club. But surprisingly, instead of continuing as a classroom teacher, Josephine went to Boston and completed a one-year degree in nursing at the New England Hospital for Women and Children. Looking at this photo,
Here she is. Right. There. There she there.
You get a feeling for her personality if you notice that she's the only one observing the photographer. She went on to practice nursing, serving in the Red Cross stateside during World War I. When the war ended, she was once again
living on the house
in the house on the hill.
She was
40 years old,
and he was 29.
He had built himself a camp house on Indian Point where his
Family had spent many summers.
Roy's camp was
Part of an artist community of summer out-of-towners, Georgetown's first tiny house dwellers.
though not in winter. Roy was described by people who knew him as introspective,
Scholarly, and a bit shy.
He
had a Harvard
degree, as well as one from the Boston
Conservatory of Music
that qualified him to perform and compose. And when they met, Roy was teaching in Stamford, Connecticut at Cherry Lawn School, a progressive preparatory school, one of the first coeducational boarding schools in the country. They were married in the summer of 1920. Josephine's wedding dress was made of silk plumes, which had been introduced to the ladies of Georgetown by the fashionable Madame Mercedes, wife and model for renowned sculptor Gaston Mercedes. In the early 1900s, plumes was precious and costly, and durable, apparently, since it had survived the Maine winters for 100 years. It lives in a climate-controlled environment now
at the Georgetown Historical.
During the years of their marriage, Roy alternated between teaching and more training, studying in Paris, the University of Grenoble, and then Harvard again to complete his PhD studies. Josephine and Roy had traveled to Paris for their honeymoon and expanded their exploration of Europe when they went again twice more for Roy's education. In the 1925
trip to Paris, Frankfurt, and then London, which lasted from June to August, Joe kept a diary, writing every 3 or 4 days. It is one of the few documents we have of her handwriting and style. It is a precise record of their activities. Generally, they would breakfast at their hotel,
plan which sights to see that day, and then head out into the streets, an urban world completely different than where they actually lived, filling their senses with
art, historic architecture, popular music,
and music of the master, until they returned to their hotel exhausted after walking all day. I'm going to read you a bit from this
very first entry made June 11th, 1925, so you can hear her voice.
Roy and I had a very cool, comfortable night
on the train to New York, and after breakfast at Grand and after breakfast at Grand Central Station,
we sat there to read the paper, and then Roy had his hair cut, and we took a taxi to Pier 86 to look up our baggage. While there, we took turns in pricing out for lunch, while the other watched the bags. A professor in a Texas college came up and introduced himself and sat down and talked for some time. A student of his came up, a Hindu, and he introduced him. His name is Mr. Advanti. At 4 p.m., we lined up to get on board. The passports and tickets were examined, and then we went on board the Leviathan. Roy's parents financed this trip, as they were convinced by him that without this continental education, he would remain at a disadvantage, since his elite boarding school students were already very familiar with the cultural sites of Europe.
After 3 months of hotels and restaurants, Joe was very happy to go home. She had recorded a moment-by-moment memoir of the trip, and she could relive those days years later in front of a winter fire, perhaps. while they were away from Georgetown during the school year. They returned
every summer to the
family home, living in a vast multi-room house up on the hill. Though a bit removed from the hustle and bustle going on in the center of town,
they fully engaged with their homestead,
doing the work of surviving in rural Maine.
Attention library patrons, we still have several vehicles that are dangerously parked, including 2 Subaru Foresters, one that is white with the license ME04548, one that is blue-gray with 704JNC. We also have a white.
managing the food for heating, managing
also
the
have-
wood for heating and cooking,
91588.
drawing well water, growing food, helping the family neighbors.
All the while pursuing their own passions.
Roy's passion was
Composing music,
a mix of
popular and religious songs.
Some were published and admired. But as a composer, he struggled to
Make his mark in that field. Although he had been
richly educated in French literature, Roy took a keen interest in the local tear-spinning retired ship captains and fishermen. He spent long hours listening to the adventures of one in particular,
Captain Horatio Nelson Drake.
Roy listened and wrote them down and turned them into short stories, devoting much attention with his strange musical ear to capturing the distinctive Downey's accents and turns of phrase. Alas, he had no luck getting them in print. His stories remained unpublished, just like many of his songs. But they remain in the archives at the Georgetown
Historical. For Josephine, every sojourn in Georgetown was invigorating. She had some scientific training and experience as a teacher and a nurse, and combined with an infectious curiosity, she studied every aspect of her natural surroundings. She taught herself through careful observation in field, forest, and
under microscope,
all the while amassing collections of ferns, mosses, and lichens, and then cataloging them. I borrowed stock photos from the web,
some of the more alluring mosses and lichens
that Joe would have known well
and been able to
tell us all about.
Joe was not the only passionate naturalist
on the island.
There were 2 others, both of them summer residents from Massachusetts.
Massachusetts.
Helen Knowles, aka Mrs. Hollis Webster,
As she was known in polite society.
and Elizabeth Marie Dunham, aka Mrs. Robert Reed. Both had published books. Herbs, How to Grow and Use Them, 1933, and How to Know Mosses, 1916, which are still available from Maine Library. They encouraged Josephine to enter her artistic dish arrangements
of mosses and
lichens in the 1939 New England Spring Flower Show. For which she won a bronze medal
and $10.
A newspaper account
Praised a prize-winning exhibit reporting most of the
70 species have no common names, being unrecognized save by botanists who
specialize in this technical field.
But the mosses, all their small size, possess
Possess
a marvelous range of form,
color,
and beauty, ranging from plants just like tiny fir trees, down to plants which bear caps and bells
like creatures of mythology.
This major horticultural event was reported in New England newspapers, and Joe pasted the articles into the scrapbook she had been keeping
for years.
It was the beginning for Joe of wider recognition
As a botanist, making her a sought-after guest of honor
at garden clubs in southern Maine. These were no small social affairs,
often with
15 to 25 ladies attending, all of whose newsworthy names were reported alongside Joe's. She would bring along masses of mosses and lichens, not only as teaching aids, but for the sake of providing what was needed for making herbariums to take home. On occasion, the garden club members would travel to Georgetown. Josephine's reputation as a hostess
Was often praised.
I'm going to read to you from the report of the Kennebec
Valley Garden Club.
16 ladies arrived just before 1 o'clock, and having viewed the specimens of pressed mosses and lichens in the dining room of the house, descended to the west
Cove shore and ate a picnic lunch. 2 large tables were covered with specimens of wood plant life, very colorful and beautifully arranged. At the talk following the luncheon, each lady made up a herbarium of 16 specimens.
The walk for identification
Of types in their native environment took the time of
the afternoon until 4.
the party, returning by way of
Mrs. Newman's herb garden
was later served iced tea,
deliciously
spiced with orange mint from that garden.
and departed, expressing great satisfaction in the afternoon under
Mrs. Newman's guidance.
the golden age of garden clubs being formed along state lines under the umbrella of the National Council of State Garden Clubs began in the 1930s. In 1931, when the Garden Club Federation of Maine was formed, there were 8 charter clubs. Now there are 37. The Cosmopolitan Garden Club in Bath made Josephine Newman a lifetime member in recognition of her outstanding work in the state. Her years of nature study and
Maturity as a teacher
led her to take
every opportunity to share the knowledge and enthusiasm
even when she was working
at Bath Iron Works during World War II.
She established a nature education program there. Jo encouraged her husband to
Also work at the yard.
which he did for a time, but
Found impossible.
telling a friend it was worse than anything scientists would have conceived in his inferno. In the last year of the war, Josephine and Roy
left
moved to Andover, New Hampshire, where Roy taught music and language at Proctor Academy. They joined the Unitarian Church, and Josephine continued her mission to teach young children about the natural world, establishing a junior Audubon Society
while she was there for only a year. This is the letter of appreciation from the vice president of the society.
In 1946, Josephine and Roy were back in Georgetown, where their lives
Took a tragic turn.
one morning, he was down the lane at her sister Maud's using the washing machine. Roy drowned himself in the pond behind their house. No one then or now
And say for sure why.
As devastating as that experience must have been for Josephine, her life after Roy's death was not lonely. He is quoted as saying, "People talk about my being alone up here, but I never feel alone. When I feel alone, it's when I'm among many people, none of whom shares any of my interests. Then I am really alone." In a recent conversation with an 81-year-old woman who spent her youth in Georgetown, she described the impact
Of spending time with Jo one summer. As a 10-year-old, I was
independent.
I hung out with 4 boys, but I would go to
see Jo alone.
I'd walk up her road,
road. We would walk
around
around
her yard, and she would pick leaves and make tea. I
still
still
do that.
She was the perfect magic woman. She listened to me.
Not
Too many people did that with a 10-year-old.
She was what I wanted to
grow
grow up.
up to be.
Jo's family and friends were witness to her
Special relationship with the chickadees in her woods.
friend and cousin of Joe, Helen Frame Peters, remembers.
Her birds are almost tame.
People usually fly to her when she goes out. Every year at Christmas time, Joe has a party for the chickadees. She invites about 20 people, gives them handfuls of birdseed, and then whisks. And the birds come in a flock, biting on everyone's heads, shoulders, and hands. It is a beautiful picture. Everyone standing in the snow around a huge bonfire, chirping chickadees everywhere. Many others left a visit with Joe, remembering the wonderful encounter long afterwards.
Harry Stone,
a longtime friend and frequent visitor, often included a humorous sketch with his thanks. Though she left her classroom years ago, Josephine engaged the young residents of the town whenever she could. Here's a recollection by her longtime friend, John. I was among the legions of children who, divided by numbers and years, had been led sternly through Josie's woods and along her shorelines to be introduced to the astounding diversity of flora and fauna, accented by vigorous stabs of her walking stick to make sure we focused on the right object. She introduced us one day to a shaggy old snapping turtle who was laying eggs on the edge of her sandy driveway. We were riveted to the moment by the appropriate mixture of fear and fascination, but not so much that I missed the brief softening in her tone as she helped us understand how the little drama at our feet fit its cogs into the great wheel of life around us. Joe maintained a wide correspondence with other naturalists, including a famous one, Edwin Wade Teal, known as one of the 20th century's most influential naturalists and the first naturalist to win the Pulitzer Prize. Edwin Teal knew about Josephine Newman because a half a dozen years before they met, she had written him a letter about her efforts to preserve her land. She wrote to Teal, "In order to save my 400 acres for nature study, I have to sacrifice nearly everything else in my life. I snowshoe to the well for water, and I'm riding the snow by kerosene lamplight, while I turn on my battery radio to listen to the Secretary of State." A few years later, traveling thousands of miles across the country, Teal was completing a 4th volume in a series on the seasons. In this volume, Wandering Through Winter, the book for which he won the Pulitzer Prize, Teal describes trekking to Georgetown to meet Josephine Newman. We found the deeply shaded lane that climbs among evergreens to her house. It was clogged with drifts and imprinted with the tracks of snowshoes. Pulling on high-top leather boots, my wife and I plowed up the hill. The woman who answered our knock at the double Christian doors of the old house was 5 feet, 2 inches tall. She weighed about 100 pounds. She had slipped into her constant companion, a 35-year-old jacket with long yellow fur. It was this jacket that the chickadees recognized. Teal goes on to say, "Of all the people we met from Silver Strand to Caribou, few, if any, seemed enjoying life so much as Josephine Newman. She chopped wood for her kitchen range, and in summer raised vegetables in the garden behind the house. Still active and energetic in her 80th year, she skated, ran like a deer, and scooted over the drifts on her snowshoes, like a water strider on a summer pond." The Teals visited Joe again right after his book was published in fall 1965. She had left her beloved land and chickadees
when she had broken her ankle 5 years earlier and moved in with her sister Maud,
just a short walk away
away from all she held dear.
This photo with Edwin Teal is
Probably from that visit.
It is one of the few we
Have of her smiling. She was age 6.
In her last years, she was less able to
enjoy her land,
but she devoted herself to making sure future generations
would. When she died in 1968, her will directed that Maine Audubon
would receive the
400 acres that were not jointly owned with her 2 living siblings,
stipulating that the
society preserve and protect the property for the study of wildlife and other ornithological, botanical, and natural history purposes. Those
115
acres are now known
as the Josephine Newman
Audubon Sanctuary.
As caretakers
Of
of
Joe's property, Maine Audubon determined after study to take down her old house
first dynamiting and then burning the rest
to
to
the
the ground,
ground.
as that was most efficient and the least costly way of removing it. They
Wanted no part in maintaining
a rundown farmhouse. A few years later, and with the
help of the Maine
Extension Service and the Chilwaukee Foundation team and volunteers, hiking trails were
added,
complete with an environmental guide,
guide, enjoyed by visitors,
and incorporated
into curriculum by teachers. Throughout the years, Audubon has always maintained the integrity of the 2.5 miles of trails.
They have recently renewed their commitment to preserving what they were entrusted
With 55 years ago,
and are in the process of revising the educational guide, upgrading the walking bridges, and pushing back
against the encroaching tree growth surrounding the meadow. Here is a sample photo of the present sign at the end of Josephine's driveway. I wanted to document it because there is
a new one coming soon.
If you haven't already,
You will visit
Joe's Sanctuary.
When you do, that you bring to mind the feeling you have now of the woman
Who loved and cared for the land
and
for all the creatures.
who live there. Josephine and
Roy are buried next to each other at the Oak Cemetery in Georgetown.
But her real memorial marker is the land she gave to us all.
Of Joe's fern collection and some of Roy's short stories and interesting.
These are the
This is an article from the Portland Press Herald about the receiving of a gift and has some details in there that I didn't include. But you're welcome to come and look at them. Here's 2 copies. Because I know you're going to want to look at these. They're out of print, but they are, like I said, Audubon is putting them, redoing them and putting them back in print, and they're wonderful. Available for sale. Probably not for $3 like they were. But they have, when you go take a walk in the sanctuary, they have wonderful descriptions and the markers that are along the trail are all identified in them and will make your walk much richer if you have one of those books. And are there any questions?
Please.
Yes.
What happened to the rest of her land, the 400 acres?
Yeah. She had siblings that were still living. And so they got to, and part of it, and because it was some of it was jointly owned. They kept theirs and she gave hers away. Chester.
I got a piece of that land.
How did you get that?
Of course you did, Chester.
Georgetown contingent.
You could tell.
His grandmother was a cousin to Josephine. And when she died, Josephine owned land on the east side of the cove on the east branch. And my grandmother wanted some shorefront that she owned. So she purchased 330 feet of shorefront, which is, on the cove, but you can't do anything with it, although I do have a dock off it, but she purchased it from sisters, sold off, signed off on it. And she purchased it for $150 in 1968. We still have it. But it's worth a little more than that now.
Lauren, did you read Edwin Teal's book, Wandering Through
I
Winter?
read the whole thing, but I still have it checked out, although I got an overdue notice.
I know.
Oh, they stopped charging fines.
No children.
No children. Remember, she was
Yeah.
older. And
She loved the children in town.
she loved them.
I spent many a day wandering through the woods with her.
That original foundation where the house was burnt down in the pond right behind there,
Yeah.
was there a prehistory before she got it?
There's no answer to that question.
What's that now?
The history of
Who
it.
asked for
Where she
Josephine?
got it, because that pond looks like an ice pond.
Mm.
Probably somebody would have been living there harvesting ice at one point before it was all grown in like that. So I was wondering.
I don't know that. So the house originally was one story. In the 1880s, when the rusticators started to come to Maine in the summer, they jacked the house up and put another story underneath. So they have more rooms so people can rent.
And you said the reason for doing that was.
So they could rent rooms, turn it into a sort of a boarding house.
Because all through there is all the stone walls. There must have been pasture land out through there at one point.
All pasture.
There were no trees. There were no trees.
While she was alive, every other year, she would have a forest ranger come in with a oil squirt gun filled with yellow paint. He would walk all through her woods and a tree needed to come down. He'd squirt the tree. And she had, at least while I was a child, she had a woodsman that came from Bodenham, 2 teams of horses, and he'd cut and they'd drag out because she didn't want any mechanized vehicles in her woods. So the horses were what she used.
Why is it a concern of Maine Audubon to preserve the open space? That field on that orange trail.
I did not ask them that question.
Does
Does
anybody in
the audience have an idea?
What was the question?
Well, why does Maine Audubon want to keep the woods from encroaching?
Sure, there's certain birds, I take care of the property for Maine Audubon, I'm Glenn Evans. My former boss over there, Peter Bacher, may know a little bit too, although he's kind of hiding. No, there's birds that like the open fields, woodcock, for example, need open space for their mating and
So you're talking about that one field that's filled with milkweed, that's at the head of the beginning of the trail,
Yes.
just beyond the front.
yes, correct. So it's maintained to keep that open space for certain wildlife
Turkeys like
that
it too.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
The milkweed comes back. The milkweed is, I mean, I was there once in beginning of July, and the milkweed was in bloom. It was intoxicating, and the monarch butterflies were all over. And it looked like something that somebody should be filming for a
Yeah.
nature show. It was just spectacular.
Great, thank you.
Just what Glenn said, that edge habitat brings more diversity, so they've maintained it. But I inherited that management plan. Glenn was doing it even back then. It struck me as a reasonable thing to do.
I have another question about the cabin trail. Whose cabin is that up there? Or
I don't have that information.
I've heard some things. I hesitate to, I don't want to say something incorrect. I don't know this for sure, but I thought I heard that was for Roy.
Oh,
Roy, that had been built. It was kind of like a little getaway to maintain marital bliss, perhaps. I don't know. But yeah, I think that's what that was. And I think, I may be wrong on this. Jack Williams may have had something to do with building that. But I don't know if that's quite right. That may predate Jack Williams, but yeah, speaking of which, I'll bring up a few questions I've had. Of course, you said you lived near where Billy Todd used to live, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and I may have misheard Billy Todd, but she told me she was a sister-in-law to Josephine Newman. Is that correct? And if so, what was the connection?
I believe so. Maud Todd was married to Will Todd. Maud was Josephine's sister, and I think that's how the connection.
So that wouldn't be quite a sister-in-law
No.
per se, it'd be more like
No,
an
relative, but
aunt-in-law
not
or
a
something.
sister-in-law.
Yes.
When I was going to school in Georgetown in the sixties, Josephine, or Josie as we called her, was living with Maud and Will Todd at the top of the hill there. And she would come over in the spring, especially walking over and just looking across to make sure her house was still there. And she usually had a coat similar to that on. How's that? A big fur coat, and she walked over.
I was just gonna say, I certainly don't know the history of the land, as was asked earlier about who owned that land beforehand. But, and no chuckling, Ellie, but the Olivers and the Traftons both owned land in and around the west and east branch of Robin Hood Cove. So it wouldn't shock me to learn that the Olivers had some ownership of that land for quite an extensive period of time. Because we're talking about, the tide mill eras of the Traftons and the Olivers having land there.
Right. So, and that of course is her pretty is larger than Joe. So it's a little revealing.
The first time I ever saw pictures of her,
I thought this woman, she must be 6 feet tall.
yeah, she looks pretty.
and then we saw the dress, right, Ellie, and we thought,
Oh, she really was a peanut.
Amazing.
But strong.
things haven't enjoyed it.
Where's her grave found?
In Oak
Cemetery, Georgetown, the big white church on the way to the transfer station. And when you walk through the gate, it's boom, right there on the right, first two, and then her parents are right next to them. And they are recessed in the ground. I walked over them without even knowing the first time.
Oh my gosh.
No.
Just your regular.
You.